We're here at Slee Off-Road today to talk about our new skid plate system for the third generation Toyota Tundra. At the time we're making this video, the Tundra has been out for 2 full years, 22 and 23, and the Sequioa, which has the same drivetrain, has been out for 1 year, the 2023. We expect that in the future, this skid plate system will also work through the entire line of the third generation Tundra. Seen here is the front portion of our skid plate system. It is made up of 2 separate components. Moving rearwards, we have our transmission skid plate. Incorporated in this is the wings for the catalytic converter theft protection. And lastly, we have our 4th component, which is our transfer case skid plate. All 4 components of the Slee skid plate system are made out of 7-gauge steel. The 7-gauge steel is grade 50. Grade 50 steel is 30 to 40% stronger than the traditional mild steel, indicating that it takes 30 to 40% more pressure on that piece of steel to create a bend in it. All 4 components of our skid plate system is coated in our 4-step signature powder coat process for the best corrosion resistance possible. As we know now, choosing the Tundra or Sequoia, there are a few drivetrain options available. In the Tundra, you have the option of the twin turbo V6 only or the hybrid version as well. In the Sequoia, we have the hybrid only. When choosing the Slee Off-Road skid plate systems, you do need to choose the appropriate skid plate system for your drivetrain. If we're talking Sequoia, that's pretty straightforward as it's only hybrid. If we're talking Tundra, you will choose either the skid plate system for the hybrid or for the twin turbo V6. The difference is the addition of the hybrid adds length to the drivetrain, and in doing so, it moves the crossmember rearwards. Seen here is the version for the hybrid version. This is going to be much longer. If choosing for the non-hybrid option, this skid plate will be much shorter as the crossmember is such. The second thing to take in consideration when choosing the skid plates for your Tundra or Sequoia is if you have a vehicle that included the factory TRD heavy-duty skid plate, you can use the rear section only, or if you would like to just replace that and get the full section, you can do so as well. So if you have the TRD skid plate, rear section works for both the hybrid and non-hybrid, or if you want to discard or did not have the TRD skid plate, you would buy the full section as a 4-piece system. Our skid plate system can be bought as a rear section only to retain the TRD skid plate or the entire section. Our hardware kits are broken up in 2 different sections. Seen here is the hardware kit for the front section of the skid plates. We have 8mm bolts. We have the bolt head protection washers. These washers keep the bolt heads from getting broken off under hard impacts under the vehicle. And lastly, we have our 8mm flat washers. Seen here is the installation kit for the rear section of the skid plate system. Included in this kit is the crossmember nut plate. We have our 2 lollipop nuts, 3/8 bolts, 8mm bolts, and bolt head protection washers. As we have 2 different kits here that can be used independently or as a whole, do make note that you may end up with 2 additional bolt head protection washers and 2 additional bolts as the kit is used as a complete assembly. You can use these at a different location if needed. We'll cover that in a later portion of the video. Okay. So the first step in the installation of the skid plates is to remove any existing factory skid plates you have. This may be a piece of plastic or it may be a component that's made out of aluminum. All of those are going to use a 12mm socket. Okay. So the skid plates are installed from the rear of the vehicle forward. This is due to the design of the overlap of each individual piece. The overlap is intended to, if you were to drag something from the front of the car to the back, you're not going to encounter any seams and everything can smoothly drag in that direction. The next step is to locate the rear crossmember. The rear crossmember has 2 bolts on either side. On the driver's side of the vehicle, we're going to remove the nut on the innermost bolt only. The next step is to install our crossmember nut plate. Our nut plate is directional. We want to install it such that the nuts are facing upwards, and you can see this bar is biased towards the rear of the vehicle. We're going to install it actually upside down. We're going to feed it through the hole. Line up the nuts with the hole, and then rotate with our fingers 180. And we'll drop right into position where you can see all 3 nuts exposed. The next step is to find our stud. Our stud installs in the middle nut of the nut plate. This is temporarily installed just by hand. Okay. So we're going to work for the rear forwards. We're going to start with our transfer case skid plate. Our transfer case skid plate has our 3 mounting holes that line up with our cross member, as well as our ear on the side for the bolt to line through our slot here. Working on this only, we're gonna line this up here. We can let it hang and loosely install our nut. With our nut loosely installed, we can rotate this up and align it with our stud. Once this is up, we like to use a clamp and clamp it in place. This makes it a little easier for one person to install this. Once we're clamped up here, we're going to go back to our cross member bolt, push this upwards, and we're just going to snug it up for now. Once this is snugged up, we can come back and remove our clamp and move on to the next component. So using a jack stand, we're using a transmission jack here, or hey, 4 of your best buddies, we can push the transmission skid plate up into place. What we're shooting for is to align the middle slot with our stud that's in place. That gives us a good starting point. With this in place and everything a little bit loose so we can wiggle it around, we're going to grab one of our 3/8 bolts. Our 3/8 bolts assembled with the bolt, the lock washer against the bolt head, and then finally the flat washer. This assembly is going to slide into our bolt head protection washers, and then using a 9/16 socket, we can thread this in by hand. By pulling down on our previously installed stud, we can now push up and get our threads easily started. Moving on to our second. Once we have these two installed, we now will remove our stud. And lastly, install our 3/8 bolt in this final location. So the next step is to install the outer hardware on our cross member. To do so, we're going to grab our lollipop. Our lollipop nut, we're going to eyeball our mounting hole here on the cross member. It's going to install from this opening here. I'm going to make a small bend to feed it through there. Feed it through the outside. I can now eyeball to get it lined up with the hole that we have the provision on. Grabbing another one of our 3/8 bolts, lock washer, and special aluminum protector nut. We're going to come in from the bottom and get this started by hand. And we're just going to repeat the other side, same as previous. Once we have all 5 pieces of hardware in this rear mounting section, we're going to snug these up and move on to the next front bridge plate. The factory TRD skid plate, that will be installed at this point. Factory TRD skid plate will use the original bolts in the forwardmost locations. They'll use the original bolts in the middle locations. For the rearmost locations where it overlaps the Slee off-road skid plate, you will use the new included 8mm bolts along with the bolt head protectors. 8mm bolt installs with no additional washers, using a 12mm socket. You can thread these in by hand. We'll cover the torquing sequence of the entire skid plate system at the end of the video. We're now installing the rear section of our front skid plate. The skid plate overlaps the fingers or wings on our transmission skid plate. We are going to use 2 of our 8mm bolts along with our bolt head protectors. Using a 12mm socket, we install these by hand. Moving on to the front section of our rear portion of our front skid plate. We're going to locate our slotted holes here, and again, 2 more 8mm bolts with our aluminum bolt head protectors. We're going to install these by hand loosely. We're finally at the front portion of the front skid plate. This contains 4 different mounting holes. There's a couple variables here. If you purchase the front kit on its own, you're going to use the flat washers on these lower locations. If you purchase the kit as a complete assembly, you'll have 1 extra set of aluminum bolt head protectors, and you can mount them in these lower locations. Okay. On the frontmost top locations, we have a couple options on how this gets installed as well. If you are utilizing the Slee off-road recovery points, we're going to use an additional washer between the factory cross member and the top of the skid plate. You then will use this supplied 8mm bolt with the large flat washer and install this here. If you're using your sway bar in the stock location, i.e. no Slee off-road recovery points, you can forego this washer between the cross member and the skid plate. The next step is going through and torquing all of our bolts. All of the 8mm bolts are torqued to 20 foot-pounds. At our rear cross member, we have our 5 3/8 bolts in addition to our 1 cross member bolt. These are all torqued to 30 foot-pounds. Lastly, we need to clean up the tails from our stick nuts. The tails have the indentations. These can be cleaned up by 1, bending them back and forth until they break off. 2, you can bend them out of the way. Or 3, using a pair of side cutters, you can cut them off. Now that we've fully installed our complete skid plate system, let's talk about some of the features and benefits and design cues that were included in this. The front plate is only held on with 4 bolts. This is intended to be removed during an oil change to access the factory oil filter. Another design cue seen here is easy access to the factory eccentrics. This is important when aligning your vehicle. You can easily gain access with a wrench to the front and back without removing the rear section of the front skid plate, though the front section of the skid plate may need to be removed to gain access to the very frontmost bolt. The reason the front skid plate needs to be removed to gain access to the eccentric is that it offers a nice smooth surface to protect impact of the front bolt. There is a nice oval access hole here to allow access to the factory drain plug of the engine oil. In our transmission skid plate, we have a nice hole to gain access to the drain plug for the transmission oil. Seen here is the wings of the transmission skid plate. These allow for theft deterrence of the factory catalytic converters. At the rear of the skid plate, we can see our bolt head protection washers. These are intended to still access the head of the bolt should you drag something through them. These are intended to be sacrificial. All the way at the rear, we see our transfer case skid plate. This is intended to retain the factory transfer case skid plate during a large impact. This will deflect and disperse the load through the 2 units. Thank you for following along through the installation process. I hope you are now familiar with all the features of the system. If you are watching this video before purchasing the system and have any questions that have not been answered, feel free to give us a call at the shop, 1-888-4x4-SLEE, or find additional information on the website, sleeoffroad.com. Thank you.